So, no pressure, but now I'm going to introduce our next speaker who you possibly will know. Martin has over 20 years experience in health services and has held a number of health sector roles. He is currently, according to Google, please correct me if I'm wrong, the interim workstream lead for commissioning in localities. No, homai te pakipaki.
Kia ora everyone, Martin Hefford. Armajit texted me, she's been busy on the little phone today. She's like, oh, how do we introduce you? So I said roving executive. So I've been involved with the transition unit back a year and a half, year and 3/4 ago now. So been involved in that space for the last year and a half and a bit longer, developing policy, cabinet papers, budget bids, all that stuff, and then helping to see the implementation through with the interim Health New Zealand and then the Pai Ora legislation and the establishment of Te Whatu Ora and Te Akawhai Ora. And so I'm due for a good lie down now. It's been quite a long journey. And if things go to shit, then you're looking for someone to blame, then put my hand up. Thought I'd give you a quick update on the thinking around localities and where we've got to on that. And I know that it needs to be relatively quick, so we will do that. Now, we had a little snapshot of this I saw before. Doug put it up, and this is a kind of the more advanced version. This picture tries to capture actually some of what the two previous speakers were talking about, and in particular, understanding, as they said, that a lot of our health and well-being and a lot of the disparities in health and well-being are not related to the provision of health services. They're related to, the socioeconomic determinants that we know about housing and having a job and, have you got adequate income and, do you live in a society where your ethnicity is valued, or are you marginalised and excluded? The tūranga waiwai, that sense of belonging and a place to stand, and so there's those bottom tier of things on that diagram, that schematic. And then on the right hand side, the whole environmental stuff, the whole, going into that in a bit more detail, clean water, which we used to take for granted in New Zealand, and now I think not so much. Clean air and things like, in New Zealand we don't have standards, as I understand it, for exhaust particulate. So, we have old cars that spew out a lot of particulate into our urban areas, and that's not great for our lungs. We can't take clean air for granted necessarily. Access to the green environments and parks and those facilities which are vital for well-being. And then things like the built environment and how urban planning is done, and the way that's structured to create communities or to create fragmented kind of neighborhoods. And again, that's outside of the scope of the health system. And then on that other side of that diagram, the behavioral and lifestyle things, the things around, do we smoke, how much do we eat, what do we eat, how active are we, sexual behaviors, gambling, that whole range of stuff that, on a bad day, people point at us and say, well, it's your own fault, no wonder, if only you didn't eat all that, or, if you only didn't spend your money that way, or blah, blah, blah. And of course, we know that those behavioral factors are heavily influenced by the environmental and the socioeconomic factors and the alienation and so on that people talked about, and so have to be seen within that context. And then at the top there, a recognition that actually some of it is about health services. There is a purpose to providing health, and it does make a difference for people at times. And part of the responsibility there is for us to make sure we're connected up, that we're not, doing crazy stuff such as we do now, where, when we have, when you're a woman, you're pregnant, have a baby, we have a a maternity service that involves LMCs looking after you, lead maternity carers, and not connecting up with the GP that you might see normally. And then after the baby's born, handing over to a well-child provider, well-child tamariki ora provider. Again, that provider normally never talks to the midwife that's just helped you with your labour and birth, and neither of them talk to the GP that you're taking the kid in to vaccinations around. I mean, like, could you design a more fragmented system? And the miracle is that for most people that works okay, but if you've got some complexity or difficulties, that's where it falls between the cracks. Now I'm just going to make sure my phone's out here so I keep track of the time. Otherwise, Armajit will text me saying the minister's waiting. So we're saying, well, look, we understand this. You know, this is known. Therefore, what can you do about it? Do you just give up and say, well, it's all too hard? 80% is non-health anyway, so, you know, good luck. The idea of the localities is to say, well, with collective action, and I know you all understand about that because people have talked about it today, and alignment, then we can make a difference to at least some of these other factors. And so let's get going. Let's try it. Let's not pretend. You know, we're going in with a theory that says if we work together, if we have common goals, have backbone services, et cetera, and if we, in New Zealand context, link it to mana whenua, mana motahake, tēnā rangatiratanga, and those principles, then we can make a difference. The prototypes are a way of saying, well, that's the theory, and not many theories survive contact with the real world, so let's be agile around this. Let's change direction as we go, rather than sticking to a plan for 3 years and then doing a review and deciding it wasn't perfect. So these prototypes have been put in place around New Zealand, at least one in every region, targeting places with high Māori or Pacific or rural populations. And they are coming along pretty slowly. I think Kamaji might have mentioned that this morning. And part of that is context. You know, health world is on fire, as you know, and we've just had this epidemic thing apparently for the last few years. So they've had a lot to deal with, and there's also an element of trust building, and they only ever go at the speed of trust. And we have also, because we've said, look, mana whenua need to be a key partner in your locality collaboration. In places where people put up proposals but didn't have that relationship, they've had to kind of go back and say, well, you know, when you've got the relationship, come back again. So they are working now to develop local charters, which will define their goals and how they work together and make decisions and so on. And they are working to kind of employ locality program managers, program leads, coordination leads, that backbone service that's needed. And we've got funding agreements going out this week actually with those prototypes to kick off that and to kick off the locality planning, which is where they'll try and bring the wider community to plan these things together. Going wider than the prototypes, the Pai Ora Act says Te Whatu Ora has to define locality areas across the whole of New Zealand by July 2024. And the board recently agreed to some parameters around that. So we will be quite soon going out and talking, first of all, with local iwi Māori partnership boards and local government around in each area what might make sense in terms of the localities. You know, does Otaki become part of Hora Whenua or part of Kapiti? You know, where do you put, etc., places like that? And then we'll come out with a kind of a jigsaw covering the whole of New Zealand. And importantly, none of the pieces will overlap and we won't leave anywhere out in New Zealand. So that gives us that first line, the kind of determination of geographical areas. that's just the beginning, of course, because there's also then that establishment of trust, relationships, local leadership, a partnership with the community. And then there's the planning process to start to think about how do we manage in this area. What do we need in in the East Coast? What do we need in Southland near Gore? What's special about these places? And then try and actually deliver these things. But look, in my mind, it's a marathon. It's not a sprint. We will have a lot of political pressure to kind of, we're doing this big health reform, localities. It's a go early initiative. What's happening? What's happening this week? What's happening next week? So, and because it's based on relationships, that can take a while. So let's not rush it. Let's give it some time to make it work. It's a complicated little table, which I won't go into too much, just to say that the concept of localities is not as a commissioner. They're not intended to be like a mini DHB or a big PHO. They're not a commissioning body. They are a partner to the commissioners in the system, which are Te Aka Whaora, the Māori Health Authority, and Te Whatu Ora, Health New Zealand. But a really important partner to co-design the services, etc. Some interesting things in the Act worth a read. I've just realised that the slides are down there as well. So as I said, we have to cover the whole of New Zealand, etc. We do have a specific obligation to consult with local authorities and IMPBs. And in terms of how do you decide what the jigsaw looks like, these are some of the criteria that we're thinking about as a way of making those calls. So first of all, the regional boundaries, so that things are within region. The Iwi Māori Partnership Board areas, and Iwi Māori Partnership Boards have got a statutory authority in the legislation around signing off locality plans. Locality plan is not considered complete until it's signed off by the Iwi Māori Partnership Board. It's a kind of an unusual new feature in the legislation. Local government boundaries kind of makes sense if you want to affect the natural environment and the built environment and traffic, etc., then local government are an important partner. And then there's all that stuff around natural communities. What makes sense for this area, because we go there for shopping, and the transport links are this way, and actually all the other government departments include Gisborne with Napier Hastings, Hawke's Bay, whereas in health we include Gisborne with Waikato region. Is that going to work? Does that make sense? And then population, so scale. We want a community scale, not too tiny, because then you haven't got the kind of critical mass to plan services and make a difference, and you're too small to affect these things. If you go too big, on the other hand, then you haven't got a community, you haven't got the cohesion, you haven't got the partnerships, etc. So what's that Goldilocks spot between too small and too large? And we've already gone smaller than 20,000 with the Wairoa, where it's a small but perfectly formed community, geographically isolated, good iwi leadership, local authority there, just makes sense. I'm conscious of time. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. These plans, these locality plans, they are described in legislation, and we'll see, whether that's how they actually turn out or not. If we got our dreams, then there would be a plan not just for health services, but for health and wellbeing services, and that would be, done with the police in terms of how they're doing their policing in that area, and with MSD and Oranga Tamariki and youth justice, and be a whole plan for that community. And maybe they'll start out a little bit that way and get better as time goes on. We'll see. But that's the point of it. And again, as I said, plans need to be signed off by the IMBBs. Now, one of the things on the health service side is that the prototypes are running ahead of changes to the primary and community care contracting environment. And we see that in the future as being kind of more permissive and more diverse than it has been, and see us moving on from PHO agreements to agreements that might have modules within an overarching framework, common requirements, but the ability to provide things like vaccination services. And we've already started down that path with COVID. People got involved in delivering vaccinations that never previously had. Pharmacies are now doing not just flu and COVID, but MMR, and they'll be doing childhood immunizations as well. And if you think about vaccination, we also see the need to continue to expand provision so that it's as accessible and convenient as possible. Helmut talked about trusted faces and trusted places. Exactly right. But with common support services, so that we know that the information is always gathered in the same way. We always know what someone's immunization status is. We always know they meet standards, etc. And I'm going to finish up there. Thank you very much for the opportunity to give you an update, and looking forward to hearing from the Minister next. Kia ora.